Welcome to episode 2 of the Chris Craft Show. If you like what we're doing over here, please rate, review, and subscribe over at iTunes or wherever you choose to listen to this podcast. We have a great interview today with my friend Jason Romano, a new author. So we'll be talking about his book, his story, his time at ESPN, and his Christian walk, and a whole lot more. So now we'll get into the interview with Jason Romano. Today on the show, we're speaking with Jason Romano, the host and producer of the Sports Spectrum podcast. Jason was a senior manager and producer at ESPN for 17 years for shows like SportsCenter and Mike and others. He's also an accomplished public speaker, and he'll soon add the author title to his resume. And above all, he's a follower of Jesus Christ. Welcome to the Chris Craft Show, Jason.
It's great to be with you, Chris. How you been, man?
Hey, man, I've been blessed. I've been well. Hey, kids are good. Wife's good.
No complaints.
Can't complain.
Exactly.
No complaints at all. So, hey, I love story, and you're a story guy too. I'm a fan of the podcast, and I like the way you lead with story. So I'm going to do the same thing. Tell me your story. Start as far back as you want to go, and let our listeners know who is Jason Romano.
Well, we don't have that long, but I'll do the best I can. I grew up in upstate New York. I'm from a little town called Ravenna, New York, outside of Albany, our capital. And grew up there, lived there a long time till I was till I came to Connecticut for my job at ESPN. Always big into sports, huge sports fan from the time I was a little kid. Played sports and certainly studied it. I still have memories of being 7, 8 years old and fighting my little brother for first dibs on the sports page when the newspaper would come each morning, and reading the box scores and knowing who won the night before and who did well. So that hasn't changed. I'm still a big sports fan and still love it. And so that passion began a long time ago. My career and sort of trajectory in terms of going into broadcasting started to take shape in high school. At the end of high school, junior, senior year, I started to realize that I wasn't going to be a professional sports athlete. I liked playing, but I was not that good. So I said, well, why don't we work in a business where you can talk about sports all day long? And Howard Cosell was a guy who I watched as a kid and certainly watched ESPN a lot growing up, and just kind of thought maybe I could do that for a living someday. And that would be kind of neat. So I went to college specifically for broadcasting. I majored in broadcasting and went to community college for 2 years that had a great broadcasting program, and then went to my last 2 years undergrad at a 4-year school, also had a great media and broadcasting program. So I went there and, cut my teeth and got my experience in college, and then worked 3 years locally in Albany producing talk radio. And it wasn't sports. It was just, it was kind of news talk radio. Had a blast, big fish in a small pond with a host that everybody was listening to locally, and just had a blast trying a bunch of things, doing a bunch of stunts. And it was kind of a morning zoo type radio show where we just had so much fun. And then ESPN kind of came into the picture in April of 2000. I saw a job opening on the web and applied. And honestly, that was pretty much all I did. I didn't know anybody at ESPN. I didn't have any connections. I didn't have anybody who could get me in the door per se. It was just a job listing on the internet. And so I applied for it, got a call to come to Bristol for an interview. And if the story ended there, it's an amazing story, because I never thought I would even get to ESPN. People talk about that being a dream job. For me, I couldn't even dream that big. I didn't even have an idea that ESPN could ever kind of enter into my world.
Wow.
So they called. I went out there, nervous as all could be. Went down, did an interview with like 3 or 4 different people. Got a call back that they were really interested, and eventually got the job. Amazingly got offered the job and started in July of 2000 as a producer, and worked there almost 17 years. 16 and a half years, and it was a blast. It was so much fun.
And I'm sure those relationships from that time still continue on.
Yes, very much so. I mean, when you work at
Yeah.
anywhere 17 years, you're going to build a bunch of relationships with people. And, they continued. I actually, ironically, Chris, I haven't really told anybody this. I haven't been back there. I've been gone from ESPN since February of 2017. We're taping this in October, and I still haven't been back to the offices. And it's not that I don't want to go back. It's just I haven't been invited, and I really have no reason to go back unless somebody, wants me to come and talk to them or whatever. So I stay in touch with a ton of people from there, have many breakfasts and meetings and just spending time with the people who I worked with quite a few of them, but just haven't been back in the building. So it's kind of interesting.
Well, you're a busy guy.
A little
You
bit,
have a lot
but I
going
live
on.
10 minutes from ESPN. I could get in the car
That's
now and
true.
be there
That's true.
right away, but I just haven't been back. So.
And I assume you're content with that. Let's dig a little bit deeper there. Are there any untied ends in terms of that relationship there, or is there true closure
No,
there?
it was. I mean, I left on my own account, and I didn't.
Yep,
I didn't get
I read
let go
that.
or fired or anything like that. I left because I wanted to pursue a higher calling. I was 43,
Praise
and
God.
I thought it was time to make this move now, or I might never make it. And just the move was really a leap of faith. And it's a cliche, but it's true. And taking an actual leap of faith in Christ to pursue Him, to pursue ministry, to kind of follow His calling on whatever that was going to be for my life, both with the aforementioned Sports Spectrum podcast that I'm hosting in that ministry, but also the speaking and the writing of a new book and all that kind of taking shape. I just felt like it was the time to step out a little more in faith and leave. And it wasn't an easy decision because I took a pay cut, about a 40% pay cut. And,
Right.
that requires a leap of faith. It requires, a full trust in the Lord for sure. It requires trust from my wife and from my daughter, in knowing that we're pursuing something greater than just, a paycheck here. So it was hard, but I don't have any regrets at all. I mean, I miss the people. I miss being around them and hanging out with them and certainly talking to them and working with them. But I know that God has me where I am for a reason and a purpose, and I'm enjoying what I'm
Oh
doing
yeah.
now. I really am. I love the podcast. I love being able to tell stories of sports and faith without it being sort of censored or, God left out of the picture, which happens quite a bit in the secular media world. So I love being able to just kind of tell those stories and give people a platform to share them, both on the podcast, on the magazine, and on the web.
Well, props to you for living it out and walking it out. Word and deed, right? So, talk to me about your faith walk and how, in terms of timeline, and how it intersected with your career. Do you know in general when you were saved and when that the fruits of the spirit really start to come to
I
bear?
do. It was Mother's Day of 2001.
There
So
you go.
it was a little background. My brother Chris, I have two younger brothers, Chris and Damien. My brother Chris is the first in our family to get saved, to become a Christian. And he was young. He was probably 22, 23 years old. And for all of us, we grew up Catholic and kind of nominal church-going people. I wouldn't say we had
Right.
any sort of deep religious convictions or any kind of faith walk or any kind of relationship with Christ. In fact, I'd never even heard that was a thing. Like having a relationship with Christ was so foreign to me. And my brother became a Christian in 1998 and kind of lived that out for a few years. And we thought at first that he was just nuts, that we thought, wow, this guy's crazy. He's living this sort of
Mm-hmm.
radical religious life. But he was headed down a path that was not good. And when God got a hold of him, he did a complete 180, and you saw fruit in his life. You saw the way that he loved his now wife, then fiance. You saw the way that he loves his children and was raising his kids, how he loves people, how
Mm-hmm.
he serves. And so you saw what you said. You saw that fruit. So for me, that was somewhat appealing. It wasn't an overtly, I got to have this, Chris. Let's go. My
Right.
brother's name is Chris, by the way, as well. So it wasn't one of those where I had to tell my brother Chris, this is what I got to have. Tell me. It was just him inviting me and my family to church a couple times. We went. It was weird the first time, a little less weird the second time, and the third time was Mother's Day. in 2001. And I was there, and I didn't hate the church service. I actually kind of enjoyed it. And after it was done, I told my brother exactly what I just told you, because he asked me, he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I didn't hate it." I said, "It was okay. Not bad. It was all right." And that's kind of what I said. And he grabbed a hold of me when I said that and brought me into his bedroom. We sat down. He's like, "Listen, I can sense something going on here. You didn't hate this anymore. I want to tell you about what's happened to me, and I want to tell you about Jesus." And so he proceeded for the next 15, 20 minutes to share the gospel with me, share salvation, what it meant. And I said yes.
Wow.
Now, I firmly didn't understand completely the decision I had made. I just knew that it was the right decision. And so I said yes. I said the prayer. I accepted Christ. But then it was about a year process of growth and understanding, of pursuing God, watching a lot of different sort of televangelist shows and religious shows, listening to a lot of Christian music, just really diving in and trying to understand what this decision was about. And so it was about a year process until I finally understood the decision I had made and what Christ had done for me, for all of us on the cross. And then I really made a decision to kind of get rooted in a church and kind of start walking that walk. So yeah, it's been, and I started at ESPN in July of 2000. So I was at ESPN for a little while without Christ, and then accepted Christ. So there was a time there that I had to kind of navigate that world as well, of being a Christian in the workplace and what that looked like. So, but it's been it's been over almost 17 years as a believer now. And that's been amazing to just see God.
Praise God. Were you married at the time?
I was married. My wife, not a Christian at the time. So that was a whole nother, that could be a whole nother podcast, to be honest.
We know how that could
it's
go.
hard. And when you're walking, I had an obligation, a promise, a commitment that I had made to my wife to be her husband and to love her. But at the same time, I also made a commitment to God. And so I had to kind of walk these two worlds for a couple of years, which was very difficult. But, we were better for it. And my wife ended up coming to Christ sometime in 2005 after our daughter Sarah was born in June of 2004. So somewhere in that range of having a kid and seeing, I think, the love that is poured out into your child, and seeing maybe the relationships that we have built, or that I have built through my church, and then her meeting those people and kind of just loving on her, really opened up her heart to the Lord as well.
Wow. Now, what was the introduction to Sports Spectrum, the platform, the podcast? How did that all come about?
So I was still at ESPN. We're taping this early October of 2017. So 1 year ago, early October of 2016, I get a call from a guy that I had known who worked for a ministry called Pro Athletes Outreach, and they're out of Colorado, PAO. And that ministry and I have been talking probably a year prior, just building a relationship. We weren't ready to kind of partner. I wasn't ready to leave ESPN yet, but we had been talking. And so it just wasn't the right time or the right move, but we stayed in touch.
Right.
And he called me in early October of 2016 and told me that they had just acquired Sports Spectrum. And I knew what Sports Spectrum was. I'd known the brand for a while. I knew the people that used to run it and work on it. I used to read the magazine. I used to check out their websites. Just loved what they were doing, what the ministry was about. But it was time for a change. The owner who was running it, the manager, just felt like he couldn't really keep it going in the way that it needed to keep going. So was looking for somebody to kind of take it over. And lo and behold, it was the company and the crew in the ministry that I had been talking to a year prior. And so I get on the phone and he said, "Hey, I don't know if you're still interested or if you've ever thought about still potentially leaving ESPN, but we might have an opportunity here for you. Would you like to hear about it?" And I said, yes. And the first thing he mentioned was a podcast. And I got to tell you, Chris, I've been thinking for a while now about the idea of being part of a faith and sports podcast. I never thought I would host it, but I thought I would be a part of one, because most of my background is behind the scenes, producing and editing and social media and content creation, things like that. So when he said podcast, my ears perked up. I'm like, all right, tell me more. And he's like, we want you to host it. We think you'd be a great host for a podcast, to start a faith and sports podcast. And I said, host it. Okay. I haven't hosted since college, right? And he said, yeah, but you work with the best hosts in the world and produce their shows. So you know how to interview people and you know how to ask questions. So we think you can do it. Why don't you try it? And so that was just the beginning of the process. From October, I went down to visit them in December at a conference, and we had a deeper conversation there. And then made the decision probably mid-December, after the offer came in, to leave. And after a lot of prayer and a lot of talking with my wife over this, because that was really the number one final check mark that I needed, was my wife's permission. And we aligned and equally yoked here in this decision. She said yes. She said, go for it. I think it's a great opportunity, and it's time. And, with a leap of faith and a pay cut, we took the chance, and I left ESPN. So they gave me, that was the hardest part, was knowing I was leaving in mid-December and not really being able to tell them until early to mid-January, because I didn't want to tell them too early, thinking that I might just be without a job for 2 months.
Yeah, that's wisdom.
And I also didn't want to exit immediately. I felt like I had been there long enough. I wanted to properly sort of gracefully exit out, giving them enough time to prepare for me leaving, and giving me enough time to kind of close out my career properly. I was on Mike and Mike's in the mornings show, working that show, and we still had a trip to Tampa, Florida for the college football championship, to Orlando, Florida for the NFL Pro Bowl, and to Houston, Texas for the Super Bowl. And I wanted to see those 3 trips through and then exit the week after. And it really just all worked out perfectly. And on February 10th was my last day, and I left ESPN.
Wow. Yeah. So during that time at ESPN, many Christians struggle with representing Christ in the marketplace. How did you navigate those waters? Because, God has a remnant everywhere. So, there are other believers there. So was it kind of like a club, within the entity? How did you navigate those waters?
Yeah, it was hard to find like-minded people, other believers in the beginning. I remember telling people at ESPN about what had happened to me, becoming a Christian. A couple of the people that I worked with at the time at ESPN Radio, and they were kind of dismissing it like religious fanatic thing or whatever. So I didn't really talk about my faith much in the workplace. For a long time, it was 2 separate worlds. It was the Christian world, which was Sunday at church and a little bit at home. And then it was work. And my work was definitely my identity for a long time. I mean, it was what I was known for. It was a dream job. It was ESPN. So even when I came home, it was ESPN. And when I went to church, it was that guy's from ESPN. And it was everywhere with me. Right. So I really didn't know how to walk as a believer in the workplace. I just thought it was kind of separate. When I went to work, I tried to behave a certain way or talk a certain way, but I certainly didn't live out my faith in the workplace. I just kind of went to work and did my job. And
that's the important thing. Excellence.
It is.
Excellence.
And that's completely true. I mean, Colossians says, whatever you do, do it as though you're working for the Lord and not for man. Do your work with excellence. Absolutely. But I never had a gauge on the idea that I could share my faith in the workplace. I didn't know that. And then, long story short, Tony Dungy, the great football coach, Hall of Fame coach, was at ESPN the same day I was. I was assigned to be with him and bring him around to the different shows that he was going to be appearing on. That was part of my job at the time. And this was 2010. And Tony is at ESPN. And he asks me this question: how do you live out your faith in the workplace? And nobody had ever asked me that, really didn't have a discussion about that. And I knew Tony was a believer, so it was good to have a sort of relationship on that level with him. And I answered him. I said, I don't know, Coach. I said, I really don't even sure if I'm supposed to be here. So as far back as 2010, I thought still that it might be time to go work somewhere else. Now, it's not because I wanted
this had been on your heart for a while.
It's just that I thought, as a Christian, I can't work in a secular place. Like, God has made me who I am, a child of God, right? To honor him and to glorify him. So I need to go work at a church or a nonprofit or a ministry, sports and
Right.
faith, something. And his assistant, Jessica, is with him, Tony Dungy's assistant, and looks at me when I say, I think I need to leave. And she's like, no, you don't get it. She's like, you're bright. You're supposed to be here right now and be a light to all the people in this workplace that don't know Christ. You're to bloom where you're planted at this exact moment. And I said, wow, that makes complete sense. From that moment on, that was 2010, until I left in 2017, that's exactly what I tried to do, was to just bloom where I was planted, to understand that God had me where he did for a reason, for a purpose, and to just love and serve others. And that's the sort of secret sauce in all this, is just loving and serving relationships, right? Building relationships. And as that's happening, Chris, social media is starting to take shape. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And I realized, wow, what a platform, what a way to share who I was as a believer in Christ on these platforms. So you're doing that, you're being open about your faith on social media with the people who are following you, many of which are your coworkers. Now that opens it up for dialogue, and a lot of people saw who I was, and we were able to connect and build relationships in the workplace through that. Because before social media, it's just a matter of, it's building relationships, but you still have to find those like-minded people. And so that was how I really learned to be a believer in the workplace, was just starting to build relationships, but being intentional and being unashamed about who you are, about what you believe, and using platforms like social media to not push your faith into people's faces, but just to be authentic about who you are. And that's really what I tried to do.
We agree on so many things. Wow, we could turn this into a 3-hour podcast.
We'll do it again.
But, yeah, we could do a part two. But let's drill into. And thank you for that answer, by the way. That's going to be a blessing to many others who struggle in that way. And I still, as of today, we're speaking with Jason Romano of Sports Spectrum. I still, as of today, need to listen to the new episode of your podcast with Chris Broussard.
Yes, just released.
And so I'm sure it touches on some of these items as well.
It does. We talk a lot in that episode about, Chris, about being a believer in Christ, about being unashamed. We talk specifically about an incident in 2013 when he was on Outside the Lines, and the discussion was about homosexuality. And Chris was very open about his faith and about what he thinks about certain sins that are read in the Bible. And he stood up for himself. And he knew that he was going to get a lot of backlash, but he stood up and spoke the truth in love, as he says. So, yeah, we definitely touch on being believers and working for secular companies and what that looks like, for sure. It's not easy, but it's very, very possible. And I think you can stand out if you're, if you're bold enough in your faith and comfortable enough in your faith. People will respect you if you walk the walk and talk the talk. Because it's easy to talk about being a believer, but you mentioned the fruits of the Spirit. Man, if you're not exuding joy and peace and happiness and self-control and love for others, people will see through that quickly. But if they see that fruit kind of bearing itself in your life, man, they'll be drawn to that, and they'll at least be able to have a relationship with you and respect you. It may not mean they come to Christ or anything like that right away, but the relationships and the respect level really go high when you not only talk it, but when you walk it.
Yeah, and some plant, some water, but God gives the increase. It could be a combination of two people, an interaction with you or interaction with another believer down the line, and you never know where that could turn into for a soul, right? So let's talk about where you are right now. Tell me about Sports Spectrum's mission and how it's making an impact for God in the kingdom.
Yeah, so it's been about 7 months now, 8 months almost, since I left ESPN and moved to Sports Spectrum. And Sports Spectrum has been a great blessing to me and an opportunity to start this podcast, which we launched on March 31st. We've done almost 46 episodes now of the podcast, and it's really been a blessing. Almost 80,000 downloads of the podcast have had happened. So people have listened to the interviews that we've done. But even more than that, we have a new team of like 14, 15 people, many of them based in Colorado, who are doing amazing work. and working on the magazine, which is still in existence. We have a quarterly magazine, which is just a wonderful tool to hand to people and show them some amazing stories. And it's well done. It's not some kind of cheap sort of $2 dime store magazine. This is a legit, beautiful magazine that you can put in your people's hands to read. Our website is being relaunched right now, but or redesigned, I should say, but it's been relaunched for the last 7 months, and there's content every single day on sportspectrum.com, articles, daily devotionals, just stories, inspirational, positive stories of athletes intersecting in the world of faith. And really just been managing that website has been another assignment of mine, and watching what God has done and the people that he's brought, not only to work on this project, but people from NBC, people from other large corporations coming together and wanting to work in this ministry of sports and faith, but also seeing the people that have become guests or wanting to be a part of what we're doing. It's one thing in the beginning for me to leverage all the relationships I have to try and get certain guests on the podcast. It's another thing when people are calling me and saying, "We hear about your podcast. We want to have our guest, our author, our pastor, whoever it is, our athlete on with you." And that's all God, man. I mean, that's just an amazing, awesome thing to see this sort of platform grow. And, it's one thing, we were talking about this because it's amazing. Our team has a weekly Bible study every Tuesday that we just get on a call, or we're all in the same room together, and we're going through different books. And we're going through this book called The Knowledge of the Holy right now by
No way, dude.
Yeah. Why?
I'm having a neighborhood Bible study on that exact book. We just did chapters 5 and 6 last night.
Amazing, right?
You got to be kidding me.
Awesome. Well, my boss, Steve Stenstrom, played in the NFL for a long time, and this is one of his books that he swears on. So he brought this book to our team, and we've only read the first 2 chapters. But are you kidding me that our meeting every Tuesday is a Bible study for the company I work for? Like that didn't happen at ESPN. So to be ministered in a way where we're all aligned. And yesterday, or a couple of days ago, when we had our last meeting, we were talking about idolatry. And even when you're in a ministry like Sports Spectrum, it is very simple and easy to get caught up in the idolization of even your ministry. And people will say, listen, you're in a ministry, you're glorifying God with everything you're doing. Yes. But man, if your ministry is what you're making the priority, that's an idolization and an idolatry moment for you. Man, you have to remember that it's about Christ and the cross. And so that's what we're really focused on. Even in this podcast, it's easy for me to get caught up in numbers. Oh, we got 80,000 downloads and we have 45 interviews that we've done and all these great guests. Yes. But is it glorifying God? Is it pointing people back to Jesus? Because if it's not,
that's the question.
Then it's worth nothing. And then I don't want to be a part of it. So I have to check myself kind of every so often, because I can get caught up in the actual work that we're doing as opposed to who is the work we're doing it for. And that's where we really need to focus on is Jesus. So we continually are checking ourselves as a ministry. My boss, Steve, as I said, is doing a wonderful job on leading that way. And I'm just grateful to be a part of it. And I'm actually taking a lot of that into my own world of little ministry that I'm kind of doing with my book coming out and speaking and sort of that sort of side hustle that I'm doing. Same thing. I don't want that to become an idol. I want that to be the same thing that Sports Spectrum is, ultimately pointing people back to Jesus.
Oh, praise God. So can we talk a little bit about the book, or is it still
too
early?
Absolutely. Yeah. What do you want to know?
Tell me about the book. Yeah.
The book is called Live to Forgive. It is a story. First of all, I never thought I would ever write a book, right? Like that is, as you talk about God doing work in people's lives. If you'd have asked me 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, hey, guess what? I have this sort of prophecy that you're going to write a book someday. I would have laughed in your face and told you to get out of my face, because there would have been no way that was possible. But God does amazing things, and what he's done in my life is he's taken a broken relationship with my dad, a long time broken relationship with my dad, one that saw abuse, one that saw depression for him, one that saw unsuccessfully, but suicide entered the picture. A lot of real deep things happen, unforgiveness, a bitterness that I had in my soul for my dad. and our relationship and the things that he had done. God opened up doors for me to share that story, a story I really didn't want to share too much. When you're going through things like that, it can become very personal and private, and you're like, I don't want to tell the world about my little story of my dad. But I was asked by my pastor 2 years ago, May of 2015, for the first time to preach at my church. And I said, okay. I said, yes. Now, they have 5 other people that normally preach that weren't there that day. So I was kind of just fell into my lap the opportunity to kind of share at my church. And I said, all right, I know what I'm going to talk about. I knew right away I was going to talk about forgiveness. And I said, this is the time when I'm going to share the story about my dad. So I did. It was probably 150 people over 2 services that were there. And I spoke about forgiveness. And then in the back end of the sermon, I spoke about my dad. And I told the story, the brokenness, and I told the story of how there was a happy ending. There was reconciliation. There was sobriety. There was an opportunity for him and I to kind of rebuild our relationship. But it wasn't even remotely possible on my end until I chose to forgive my dad. And it took me till I was 40 years old to do that. And so sharing that story at the pulpit, I had 4 or 5 people after both services come up to me and simply say, me too. They said, thank you. And then they said, me too. And I said, me too what? And they said, me too, I have a broken relationship with a family member. Me too, my dad and I don't get along. Me too, I have a lot of bitterness in my life over things that happened to me. And I was like, wow, God, what are you doing here? Obviously, this story needed to be told today. Fast forward a year later, summer of 2016, I'm at a teen camp, a Christian camp for teenagers, and I'm asked to be one of the speakers. So I go and I speak about forgiveness again. And I talk to 85 teenagers about forgiveness. I do the same thing. I tell the story of my dad. I tell the story of reconciliation, of brokenness, of anger, of bitterness. 85 kids came to the altar after I was done and wrote down the names of people that they needed to ask for forgiveness from, and left it at the altar. And they were all crying and weeping, and it was just overwhelming to watch. So when I saw that, and I had already been kind of tinkering with the idea of writing a book, I had kind of laid out a possible book. A friend of mine was the one who really said, you need to tell the story about your dad. And so right after that, I connected with a publisher and an author, a friend of mine who was a co-author on many books. And long story short, in that realm, August of 2016, I signed a deal with Core Media to write this book on forgiveness. And it's a very raw, very real, very personal, very gut-wrenching in some ways, but very hopeful at the same time story of forgiveness, and through the lens of the relationship with my dad. But it's about 30% application. It's a 70% narrative, and there's also application in there. So maybe your relationship with your parents are great, but you've had a tough time with a friend. Well, there's application in there that can help you navigate through that. And I'm not a therapist. I'm not some kind of medical doctor or even trained person, psychologist, whatever. I just know what I went through, and I'm just trying to help people kind of navigate through their world in things that I've learned in my relationship. So,
well, your story, your testimony speaks volumes, and that's why you get the reaction you get after you present.
It's been amazing, bro, to watch. And so we just finished the manuscript. It went to print this week, and so it's exciting. We're about 2 months away from the release. Sometime in late November, early December of 2017, this book will be available to everyone. Listen, I would love for it to sell 1 million copies, but if it really sells 5 copies and those 5 people are able to kind of come to the understanding of what forgiveness is and repair the relationship, and that's all that matters. I just want it to impact people right where they are and to help them. And I've already had a couple people who've read early manuscripts, some close friends of mine, and I didn't realize this, but they were like, you have no idea what I was going through and why I needed to read this. And I'm like, already? God, you're already doing things with this? So, yeah, totally. And I'm excited to see what happens. I'm definitely excited to see if God opens up doors to speak and to share and to travel around the country to anyone who wants to, hear a story and work through the topic of forgiveness. There's a lot of sports in this book, not all good memories. regards to sports, but there's a lot of sports. There's a lot of ESPN as a backdrop per se of what I'm going through with my dad. But I just hope, I'm scared to death, to be honest with you, Chris, because you're kind of giving your personal story out to the world, and it's a little scary, but I'm just trying to be obedient to God, and that's the only reason I wrote this book, to be quite honest with you, is because.
Well, you have a prayer warrior over here. I'll be
thank you, brother.
you.
I thank you.
And I will be buying that book.
I would appreciate that. Would be amazing. Let me know, and I'll sign a copy for you. How's that? I don't know.
Yes, that's exactly what I want.
But I definitely will.
Now, I have friends in the Northeast, and they have the hardest time finding a Jesus-loving, Bible-believing church. So, do you mind shouting out your church?
I would love to.
name?
So we're in Bristol, Connecticut. We're literally 3 minutes from ESPN. The church is called Hillside Community Church. I am one of the elders on the board of the church, so I'm on the leadership board. I work with the youth group there on Saturday nights and preach occasionally on Sunday mornings, lead our men's group, men's ministry as well. We had an amazing men's ministry time last week. So God is doing some pretty cool things. And there are more churches than you would think in the Northeast that love Jesus, that are Bible believing, that aren't sugarcoating the gospel. There are. You just got to kind of search and find them. My church is not a big mega church that you'll find in the South. It is 300 to 400 people. So it's very intimate, very small, and we all know each other. But I think that's really cool because it allows us, and we have grown, and we want to continue to grow and reach the nations, but we also understand discipling who we are within the church is just as vital in creating a healthy environment. And so we've really focused our attention, our lead pastor, Pastor Joe, and the rest of the elders, along with myself, have really made it a priority to disciple within the church as much as we are trying to reach people outside the church. And it's been awesome. It's been really cool. Yeah.
Good. In your walk, what are some of your favorite Bible verses that guide you and keep you centered on Christ and exalting Him?
So the life verse, if you will, for me has always been Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And it's a very common verse. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. And I've seen, the more I focus on that verse, I've seen it really come to light, especially in my transition away from ESPN, is when we delight ourselves in the Lord, when we acknowledge Him in all of our ways, and when we put our trust in Him first, He will direct our paths. He really will. And people ask all the time, how do I know God's plan for my life? Well, His plan is for you to acknowledge Him in all your ways. He'll direct your path. And a lot of people want to know, well, the plan for me is to be at this job or to move to this town or to do this thing. And it's like, no, your plan, God's plan for you is to be in His will, to be right in smack dab in the center of who He is. And everything else kind of makes sense. That's why the bloom where we're planted scenario for me is so important, because so many people think, I hate this job and I should be somewhere else. Like, well, maybe God has you there for a purpose. You may not like the job, but God isn't changing. So acknowledge Him. So look to Him, and He'll make your path. He'll direct your path. And so Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is a big one. There's so many verses. I think Romans 12:2 is a big one too, where it's oh gosh, I gotta look it up now. But
renewing of the mind.
Yes, it's be transformed. Seek, do not be conformed to the pattern. There it is. Don't be patterns.
That's right.
Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world. Be transformed by renewing your mind. And I think when we remember that this is just our dwelling place for now, it's not our permanent residence. If we transform our minds, or when we fix our eyes on Jesus, our minds get transformed and we focus on bigger things, greater things than just what the world can offer. So Romans 12:2 is a good one. Thank you for reminding me on that as well.
Well, that one's easy because this podcast is inspired by that. Yeah. So this is the show's kind of like Seinfeldian. There's a show about everything. Yeah. So I'm bringing people on from all walks of life, but the whole idea is to edify the listeners. And just by having you on here, people might not know, like, oh wow, so there is an intersection between sports and faith. Hey,
very much.
Let's look more into that.
It's more than people would realize too. I think that's the thing I've learned in the 8 months is the majority of athletes, they're not all Christians, but the majority of athletes have an intersection of sports and faith. There is a faith element in their lives. There is something deeper. There is something more spiritual that they gravitate to than just this job or just being a football player. And identity is such a big thing in the sports world because they're identified as these glorified celebrities, and they're all searching for a deeper meaning, a deeper purpose. So it's more apparent than most people would think. It's not just Tim Tebow, and not that there's anything wrong with Tim Tebow, and I love Tim, but it's more than just like this one guy who's like the spokesperson for athletes. No, there's so many wonderful, amazing athletes out there who are doing great things on the field, but even more want to do great things for God. And so that's my hope. My goal is to bring those stories to as many people, for us to bring those stories to as many people that can hear them. So.
Well, you're doing it, bro. Lord willing, you'll keep on
Thanks,
doing
man.
it. So what's one piece of advice that you would give to a follower of Christ who's working in the media or desires to work in the media? Because you've been there.
Well, I think there's two levels. First of all, it's okay to desire to work in media, especially secular media. That's okay. I think a lot of Christians sometimes worry like, oh, I love Jesus and I love sports, but if I go to work for ESPN, that's going to compromise my faith, or go to work for another company like Fox or whatever. And it's like, no, have those desires. God delights in the desires of your heart, right? But remember to keep him first, and don't lose your faith because of your job or because of your desires to want to pursue something earthly. But delight yourself in that and understand that God has placed you uniquely in a purpose, in a place where you are to do great things for him. So I think it's wonderful if you have a desire to go work for a place like ESPN, like I did for so many years. That's awesome. I think the best thing you can do, the advice that I give to people who want to work in media, maybe it's college students that are listening to this, is to just do two things. Build relationships. I know I said that's the secret sauce for sharing your faith in the workplace. It's the secret sauce in life. It just is. Building relationships. And that means building relationships with people who are doing the job that you want to do someday. Building relationships with people who can't necessarily get you a job, but can be somebody that you can acquire wisdom from and just talk to. And trust me, people are out there and they're willing to offer that wisdom. They're just waiting for somebody to reach out to them. So number one is relationships. Number two is experience. And it's like, all right, that's always the sort of elephant in the room, right? How much experience do you have? Well, there is no excuse in 2017 for you not to gain some semblance of experience in the media world, even if you just have to start a blog or a podcast. But do something.
That's right.
Get into these media companies, even the small ones, and just offer up your services for free. Nobody's going to turn down free work, right? So offer up yourself for free and just say, I'm here. I just want to learn. Can I be a sponge? Can I watch what you're doing? Can I gravitate towards what you're producing and just watch? Because when you do that, even though you didn't get paid, that still counts as experience. That's something you can add on the resume.
Right. That's right.
So experience, of course, but definitely relationships, because unlike myself, the majority of jobs that you'll ever get in this business always, for the most part, are built on relationships with someone somewhere. They just are.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Jason, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been such a blessing, not only to me, but to our listeners as well. And I would like for people to reach out to you. Where can they find you online and learn more about what you have going on?
I'd love that. Yeah, on Twitter at Jason Romano, on Instagram at Jason Romano, on Facebook, Jason Romano 22 is the number there and the name there.
All right.
And certainly my website is jasonromano22.com. We're going to be updating that. There'll be a link to buy the book, pre-order the book very soon. So I would imagine in the next maybe 2 to 3 weeks, hopefully we'll have a link up so people can pre-order the book. And there'll be a lot of postings about the book and keeping people up to date on when it's going to be available, the kind of content, who endorsed it, which I can't tell you yet who endorsed it because I still got to wait a couple more days. But he is well known in the sports world. Let's just say that. A childhood hero of mine. So I'm excited about the endorsement that we have, the people that have already read the book and placed endorsements inside the book for us. So lots of really great things happening. Just trying to be obedient to the Lord and let it all happen in his timing. So but you can reach me through Twitter is probably the quickest way because I'm usually on there fairly regularly. So, but look forward to hearing from anyone. Reach out about anything, whether it's the book, speaking engagements, just want to listen to the podcast or ask for advice, whatever it is, I'm always accessible. So.
Praise God. Well, keep letting that light shine, bro. And thank you for being a guest on the Chris Craft Show. We're going to have to do it again.
Absolutely. Anytime, Chris. Maybe when the book comes out, we can dive a little deeper into it. So, love to.
Oh, yeah. I'm down
Sounds
for
great.
that. Down for that. Thank you. Until next time. If you enjoyed today's show, please give us a 5-star review and subscribe on iTunes. I'd be ever so grateful. Contact the show anytime via email with your questions, comments, ideas, and prayer requests at love@chriscraftshow.com. That's LOVE@chriscraftshow.com. Or you can leave us a voicemail at 855-932-7263. Please indicate if you like your email or voicemail read or played during the show. And remember, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. God bless.